You tuned into the deep dive. Today, we're going to unpack some really quite significant moves happening on the global stage right now.
That's right. We're looking at a few key things.
Yeah, specifically, a Chinese leader's upcoming tour through Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia.
And there's the backdrop to that as well. The Spanish Prime Minister's recent visit to China. That happened amid some pretty clear pressure from the U.S.
Right, and then there's this historical comparison that's, well, it's certainly making waves. This idea that current events somehow echo Nazi Germany's 1936 move into the Rhineland.
It's a strong comparison. So our mission today really is to understand what's behind these diplomatic moves, the strategy involved.
And how it all connects, especially in light of U.S. actions.
Exactly. We've pulled together quite a range of sources to try and get a comprehensive picture.
Okay, sounds good. Let's start then in Southeast Asia. We've got this Chinese leader planning state visits, Vietnam first, April 14th to 15th, and then heading to Malaysia and Cambodia kind of simultaneously, April 15th to 18th.
And these are formal state visits, invited by top officials in each country.
So, looking at those destinations, Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, what immediately jumps out at you about that selection?
Well, what's really interesting, I think, is that Vietnam and Malaysia, they're major ASEAN members, right?
Right.
And they both have a history. One source calls it a history of anti-China actions. So that past context makes these visits pretty noteworthy.
That history definitely adds a layer, doesn't it?
It does. The thinking seems to be that China feels a strategic need to shore up its economic relationships in Southeast Asia, especially with countries that have historically been a bit wary.
Okay, so why these specific visits and why right now? The source mentions this phrase, economic minimum internal circulation and its upgrade. Sounds important?
Yeah, it sounds like core strategy. Think of it like China wanting to build a really strong economic base, within its own borders, but also with its immediate neighbors.
To be less dependent on, say, the wider global economy or potential shocks.
Exactly. Less reliant on external factors. So strengthening ties with places like Vietnam and Malaysia, which have dynamic economies, big populations, and economies that sort of complement China's, it helps bolster that internal focus, makes the whole region more resilient, potentially.
So ASEAN becomes this really crucial network for them.
Very much so. The source even calls ASEAN 10+1 a fundamental gun mount for China's wider economic aims.
ASEAN 10+1, can you just quickly break that down?
Sure. It's simply the 10 ASEAN member countries plus China. The source sees this grouping as a key platform, like the gun mount analogy, for China to project economic influence regionally.
Got it.
And these visits, especially the Vietnam one coming, only a few months after the last high-level visit in December 2023?
Relatively soon, yeah.
It really underlines that China wants to lock these relationships down, maybe nudge Vietnam, perhaps, towards aligning more closely with its vision.
Right. So, okay, that's the Southeast Asia picture.
Oh.
But at the same time, we're seeing these pretty clear tensions playing out over in Europe, specifically around the Spanish PM Sanchez and his recent trip to China.
Yes, and this really highlights the other side of the coin, doesn't it? The external pressures, particularly from the U.S., that China is dealing with as it tries to build these relationships.
And the U.S. wasn't subtle about it.
Not at all. U.S. Treasury Secretary Benson came out with some very direct statements, basically warning countries off getting too close to China, specifically mentions Spain.
Saying it was like cutting one's own throat.
Yeah.
Pretty strong language.
Extremely strong. And, China pushed back, as you'd expect.
How so?
Their foreign ministry spokesperson, Lin Jin, gave a firm rebuttal. He pointed to the strong trade numbers between China and Spain, over $50 billion last year.
And Spain's exports to China actually went up.
By 4.3%, yeah. Lin Jin also highlighted cooperation on things like new energy and working together in the UN, the WTO. Standard diplomatic pushback, but firm.
It's amazing how quickly these things spill out into the open. Now, there was another element to this story, wasn't there? Something tragic happened in Spain around the same time.
Yeah, really unfortunate. A helicopter crash on the same day these tensions were really flaring up.
Who was involved?
Agustín Escobar, the president and CEO of Siemens Spain, and his family. A terrible tragedy.
And the source connects this somehow.
Well, it notes that there's been online speculation linking the crash to the PM's visit and the U.S. pressure. The source says that association is considered not entirely unfounded.
That's quite a thing to say. Requires caution, obviously.
Absolutely. No definitive link is claimed, but it underscores the high stakes atmosphere surrounding all this, the unease.
It really does. Makes you think about the tightrope these European countries are walking, balancing ties with China and the U.S.
And it's not just Spain, is it?
No, we've seen others. UK officials, didn't the trade secretary go? And their chief of the defense staff.
Precisely. Both visited China recently. Which then raises the question, well, will German politicians be next? What's really driving these European visits, despite the clear signals coming from Washington?
It paints a picture of some serious geopolitical chess playing.
Mm-hmm.
And to try and understand the potential stakes, the source brings in that historical parallel we mentioned. Nazi Germany, 1936, the Rhineland. That feels like a very heavy comparison.
It is a heavy comparison. The Rhineland, you'll remember, was demilitarized after World War I, a buffer zone to protect France.
Treaty of Versailles, right, and Locarno.
Correct. Germany moving troops back in was a direct violation. France actually had the legal right to respond militarily, and the UK was supposed to back them.
And Hitler's move. What was the immediate impact?
Huge boost for him domestically. Made him incredibly popular, seen as restoring German pride. It really emboldened him, set him further down that path of populism, Nazism, ultimately leading towards World War II, a real turning point.
So how does the source link that moment to the Trump administration's tariff war, particularly against China?
The connection being drawn is about the nature of the move. Both are seen as adventurous, potentially destabilizing actions, high-risk gambles.
But different kinds of risk.
Yes. The source differentiates. Rhineland was traditional security military. The tariff war is non-traditional security economic. But the core point the source makes is about the response. It argues China's immediate sharp counterattack to the U.S. tariffs was absolutely crucial.
Okay, why crucial? The source gave 3 reasons, I think.
Yeah. First, the argument is it stopped a dangerous, adventurous behavior in its tracks. It potentially prevented the U.S. from trying something even more extreme later on.
Okay, interrupting the momentum.
Second, the tariff war itself was described as really aggressive, like laying all the cards on the table. Extreme blackmail almost, with potential to suddenly escalate. China's strong response, the source claims, helped contain it, stopped it from spilling over from economic conflict into, say, military conflict. Minimize that risk.
Right, preventing escalation. And the third reason, something about China avoiding isolation.
Exactly. If China hadn't hit back hard and first, it risked looking weak, or worse, like it had double standards. The source uses Vietnam as an example.
How so?
Imagine the U.S. puts tariffs on Vietnam. If China had been passive against the U.S. tariffs on itself, maybe Vietnam feels emboldened to put tariffs on China too.
Ah, I see.
Then if China retaliates against Vietnam after being weak towards the U.S., it looks bad, like it's afraid of the strong but bullies the weak.
So by hitting back hard at the U.S. initially, China set the tone, established the rules of the game for everyone, including countries like Vietnam.
That's the argument. Send a clear message. The source even mentions China needing countermeasures for countries like Vietnam, using pretty strong language like shoot the ringleader, given how much Vietnam's economy depends on China.
Highlighting that economic leverage.
And mentioning China explicitly warned Vietnam against imposing tariffs.
Oh, the source suggests Trump maybe didn't understand China's approach. That whole crossing the river by feeling the stones idea.
Yeah, the idea is Trump perhaps underestimated China's willingness to ditch that gradual approach when pushed. The source compares it to the U.S. dropping neutrality after Pearl Harbor. Sometimes decisive action is needed.
And the view is that Trump's tariff war gamble, that laying all the cards on the table move.
He lost, according to this source. Because China didn't fold, it pushed back hard.
Okay, so bringing it back to the upcoming visits to Vietnam and Malaysia, the source keeps hammering home how important stabilizing relations with them is for China's plans, especially given that history of anti-China actions.
Yes. The context provided is the U.S. strategy, framed as allying with some, attacking others, befriending distant countries while attacking neighbors.
Classic divide and conquer almost.
Sort of.
Yeah.
And China's engagement with ASEAN is positioned as a direct countermove. It's seen as the vital first step in upgrading that economic circulation strategy after getting the minimum internal circulation going.
So these ASEAN nations, Vietnam, Malaysia, they're caught in the middle to some extent, feeling pressure to choose between China and the U.S.
That's the implication. The U.S. is pushing them to make a choice. But the economic reality, especially for Vietnam, the source cites over 30% of its GDP being tied to China. That's a huge factor.
They know where their bread is buttered, economically speaking.
You could say that. The source stresses China needs to keep the U.S. in check, particularly thinking ahead to a potential Trump return for these visits and the wider strategy to work.
So the visits are a sign of respect, but there's a message underneath.
Definitely. It's like saying, We value this relationship, but don't push it too far. Don't become cannon fodder in a U.S.-led tariff alliance against us."
Because the economic leverage is there.
The economic dependence, particularly for Vietnam, is significant. The source implies China won't hesitate to use tough measures if its goodwill is, well, spurned.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. We've covered a lot these Southeast Asian visits, the Spanish PM's trip, and the U.S. pressure, this striking Rhineland comparison.
Yeah, the main thread running through the sources seems to be this emphasis on China's assertive response to the U.S., combined with proactive diplomacy in its neighborhood, seeing these as absolutely fundamental to its economic and geopolitical goals right now.
It's all deeply interconnected.
Very much so.
So let's leave our listener with a thought. Considering everything we've discussed, the historical echoes, the economic realities, the pressures, what do you think is the most likely way these relationships will evolve? And maybe more importantly, what sort of unexpected things, what wild cards might completely change the game? It really feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
Absolutely. This deep dive is really just a starting point, isn't it? There are so many layers still to explore as these power dynamics continue to shift and play out on the world stage. It's going to be fascinating to watch.